name is Benjamin Williams, and I'm the senior minister for the Central Church of Christ in Ada, Oklahoma. And I know that at this particular moment in history, there are a lot of people very deeply concerned about the question I want to try to answer today. Should I be worried about the end times? I know that's true because no matter when you watch this video, it will still be true. There has never been a time in the 2,000-year history of the church, and I think we could go back to most of the history before that, when people haven't been deeply concerned about maybe the events that we see right now are indicative of something dramatic happening. Maybe the end of everything is upon us. And if that's so, is there something I could do? Is there something I should do? It's an interesting question. If you knew this was the last week of your life, what would you do with it? It's a question that I think bothers us because most of us don't live in a way that is prepared for this life to ever end. I want to first look at what the Bible says overall about how we should view the future, whatever future it may be. And the first passage I think everybody ought to commit to memory is Psalm 56, verses 3 and 4. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me? The point of that passage is that overall, God knows there will be moments in life when we are tempted to despair, to be anxious, to have fear. And in those moments, we're taught to put our trust in God. That whatever happens in the future, and that's what fear and anxiety are about, right? We don't know exactly what will happen in the future. We don't know how it's going to work out, but we think we might have a hint, and so we start getting worried about it. However the future plays out, God is in control of the future, and God is in control of me. And so the overwhelming theme of the Bible that I want to just beat to death today until you're absolutely convinced of it is that the future is not something Christians worry about. No matter what's going on or what you see on TV or what a hysterical preacher says in his sermon, Christians don't get anxious or afraid about the future because we leave that to God. Now you might say, Ben, doesn't the book of Daniel tell us about bad things that will happen in the future? I mean, aren't there parts of the Bible, especially the book of Daniel, that has these terrifying images of beasts and monsters and nations and wars and things happening? If I knew that was going to happen soon, shouldn't I be worried about that? Well, that's not a bad thought. You're correct. The book of Daniel has lots of really scary material in it, and we're going to have a lesson talking about Daniel later in this series of lessons. At one point, Daniel even turns to the angel that's giving him these visions, and he says, I'm very afraid. I'm disturbed by this. But I would encourage you to remember the very last verse of the book of Daniel. Here is the message that Daniel is given at the end of all of his terrifying visions. But go your way till the end, and you shall rest, and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of days. And the message there is, Daniel, here's some information for you. It's 12 chapters of information, some of it comforting, some of it terrifying. But your job is just to be faithful until you get there. You are, and I love that line at the end, you will stand in your allotted place at the end of the days. When all of this comes to an end, you will be exactly where you're supposed to be. There is no chance that you will mess up the end times. There is no chance, if you are faithful to God, that whatever happens in the future will defeat you, because it's not going to defeat God. Whatever comes next, whatever's in our future, Christians aren't people that live in anxiety and fear about it. And I see so much of that, a lot of hand-wringing and nervousness about what's on the news and what's going to happen. And Daniel's just told, you're going to be wherever you're supposed to be when that day comes. Well, yeah, okay, Ben, but didn't Jesus tell us that there were really dramatic, difficult days ahead for us? Shouldn't I be worried about those things? The answer again is yes and no. Jesus did say some alarming things in his teaching. He talked about judgment. It's one of the issues that comes up the very most in his teaching is that God will judge us and hold us accountable for our behaviors. Jesus also taught that Jerusalem in particular, in Matthew 24, had some events in its future that he could tell them a little bit about. But in Matthew 24, right in the middle of discussing the future, and it was a frightening future for Jerusalem, he says, "And you will hear wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet." What does he say? I'm not telling you this, he says, to scare you. And even when it happens, you don't need to be afraid or anxious. Your job is to be faithful and to wait, because as Daniel was told, you're going to end up exactly where you're supposed to be when it's all over. For example, Jesus in John the 14th chapter, right before his own crucifixion, realizes that his disciples are going to be really concerned about the events that are about to happen. The Son of God is about to die on a cross. Their leader, their friend, is about to be crucified. And of course they're concerned, and of course they're afraid. And he tells them, this is in the future. This is going to happen. But then he says this in John 14, 1 through 4. Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms, and if it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, and where I am, you may be also. And you know the way to where I am going. What's he saying there? Again, something traumatic was about to happen in the very near future, not somewhere maybe in the murky distance. In a few hours, Jesus was going to face the cross. And he says, this isn't something to be concerned about. You don't need to be afraid or troubled by it. You believe in God? Now believe in me. Who's going to prepare the future for us? Jesus says, that's my job. God has a house, and I'm making preparations for you to be with me. And you're going to end up exactly where you're supposed to be. He ends that by saying, you know the way to where I am going. And in fact, in the next couple of verses, he tells them, I am the way. So even when distress and conflict was immediately on the horizon, Jesus is quick to say, that's not something we have to be anxious about or fearful. What about Paul? Doesn't Paul warn us? Seems like I've read, Ben, that somewhere in 2 Thessalonians, there's a passage where Paul says, before the end, there'll be a son of perdition, and he'll deceive people, and he'll trick people. And what if that's happening right now? What if there are people out there trying to trick me and deceive me? Well, that's an interesting passage, and we're going to cover that in a future lesson. But I want to start by reading the beginning of that passage. The passage you may be thinking of is 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. And here's how it starts. Now, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered together to him, we ask you, brothers, not to be quickly shaken in mind or alarmed, either by spirit or a spoken word or a letter seeming to be from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord is come. Let no one deceive you in any way. And then he begins to elaborate on his point that we'll want to talk about in some detail in a later lesson. But for right now, how does he introduce this? Again, just like Jesus and just like Daniel, he's not telling us things so that we can be afraid. He's telling us things so that we won't be afraid. He's not telling us things so that we can worry. He's telling us things so we won't worry. The Christian doesn't have to live in perpetual fear of what happens next, because the future belongs to God. Instead, he says, don't be shaken in mind, right? Mental distress, don't be alarmed. He says, even if you get a letter and it's signed the Apostle Paul at the bottom, he says, don't be worried, because here's the scoop. The day of the Lord and the Lord's future are all in the Lord's hand, and we don't need to be alarmed by that. Now, what about the book of Revelation? Ben, are you trying to tell me that you've read the book of Revelation and you're not worried about that? I mean, it's a scary book. There's a dragon in it. You're right. It is a scary book, and there's parts of it that are definitely disconcerting, and I think John was a little uncomfortable while he was seeing that vision, if I have to guess. But again, if you read the book of Revelation, you get the point over and over again that these words aren't being written to scare you. These words are being written to give you some comfort and to help you understand that the future is in God's hand, no matter how bleak it might sometimes seem. Revelation 2 and verse 10 says, "Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I'll give you the crown of life." No matter what happens next, Christians are told, you don't have to be afraid. You're not in charge of the future. You're not in charge of circumstances. You're not even in charge of the devil. Your job is to be faithful and to not be afraid. And God handles the rest. And I got to tell you, there's lots of crazy and disturbing images in the book of Revelation, but that, my friends, is the overwhelming theme. Christians don't get worried and concerned in that way. In fact, it's the other people that do. If you read the end of Revelation, Revelation chapter 21 and verse 8 says, "The fearful and the unbelieving have a place in the torment to come." Christians aren't the fearful. We're not the unbelieving. We're not the people who doubt the future. We believe it belongs to God. We follow the message of Revelation 2:10, "Do not fear." But Ben, are you really trying to tell me that we don't have to be worried about Christ's coming being imminent? Aren't there some verses that make it sound like it could happen any second? And Ben, if I knew it could happen any second, shouldn't I be concerned about that? Interestingly enough, when the Bible mentions the fact that the coming of Jesus may in fact be very soon, or near, or imminent, we'll have to discuss what those passages mean in another lesson, it always says so with a warning not to be worried about it. Let me give you two examples. Philippians 4 and verse 5, "Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand." So on the one hand, the Lord is at hand gives you this idea that there's some kind of imminence, some nearness to Christ and to the events of what Christ intends to do in the world, that he's closer than you think. Well, that sounds scary. Is he going to do something? But the warning beforehand is, well, be reasonable about it. Other translations translate that as moderate or gentle, that you don't have to be out of control. You don't have to be deeply concerned to the point of radical and compulsive behavior. Settle down. Listen to God, trust him, and be faithful. The Lord being at hand isn't disturbing to Christians. It's actually good news. You also be patient, James 5 and verse 8. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Now again, that's a tricky verse to understand what it might mean. Did James really mean that Jesus was coming really quickly? Why did he say that? Well, we might want to talk about that in a future lesson. But what I'm pointing out today is he doesn't say, all right, start getting busy doing something because the boss is coming. I used to work at a store a long time ago. It was probably my first college job. And I won't name the store, but they had this management strategy. They told us, what our job would be and our hours. And then every so often they'd say, the vice president of the company may be coming through today. We need a few of you to stay extra and straighten up. And so we would. And then the next day, the big regional manager of the company may be coming through today. We need a few of you to stay extra. And it got to the point where it was, every other day there was some crisis and they needed a little extra from us. Now, I don't have a problem with working a little extra, but it always bugged me that they were trying to motivate us based on the fear that any minute somebody important might come through. The Bible doesn't work that way. The Bible tells you Jesus is always closer than you think. But that's not something to be fearful about. Instead, it says, be patient. Establish your hearts. Settle your heart down. Get a hold on your anxiety. And recognize that it's good news, that Jesus is always closer than you think. In fact, if I may add this, every verse you're seeing flip up on the screen right now is a passage in the Bible where God, or a messenger of God, like an angel, or one of the people of God on God's behalf, tell someone, do not be afraid. Be not afraid. Fear not. It might surprise you, but maybe it shouldn't, that the most commonly repeated command in the Bible is against fear. Do not be afraid of what's going to happen next. And it doesn't matter if it's the book of Genesis, talking to patriarchs traveling across the desert sands, the book of Joshua, talking to a commander about to lead troops into battle, or Jesus himself in the New Testament telling his disciples that he's about to die. Over and over again throughout the Bible, in passage after passage after passage after passage. Yeah, they're still going over there, aren't they? The Bible, God, his messengers, and his people have one refrain. If you trust in God, that he's actually in control of the universe, there is nothing that you should ever see in the newspaper that causes you to be afraid. Christians need to be ready for the end. Let me just say this plainly. Someday, the whole big show is going to come to an end. I don't know if it'll be tomorrow or 1,000 years from now, but it's going to happen. If you're a Christian, you should be doing on that day and the day before it the same thing you were doing a week before and a month before and a year before. Your job isn't trying to anticipate what God's going to do next and then try to outthank the boss because he might come visit the store today. Your job is to be a faithful servant of God every day. And then in the peace and calmness of Christian faith, trust that God's control of the future means you don't have to worry about it. Because the truth is, there isn't anything you could do to change it anyway. There's so many things in life that we think we have control over and don't. We worry about national politics, we worry about wars, we worry about pandemics and viruses. And I'm not saying to be oblivious to those things. I want to be a good citizen. I want my country to be as healthy as it can be. I want to have good health for my family and I, if I can arrange for that. But in the end, there's a lot of things that I can do, but a lot more things I can't do. And as humans, we tend to fear and be anxious over all the things we can't do. The Bible says there's someone who can do those things, and that's the person you should leave it to, and that person is God. How often does it say it? The verses are still flipping on the screen, if that tells you any idea. Over and over again, from cover to cover. Do not be afraid. So what I'm trying to tell you today is I didn't explain a lot in this lesson about the end times. I didn't give you a verse-by-verse reading of what passages about judgment and the resurrection and wars and rumors of wars might be. We're going to save that for other lessons. What you need to know is that there's nothing that can happen, and there's nothing you can read, and there's nothing I can say that changes the fact that God is absolutely in control, and you need not be afraid of what happens next. God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of self-control, discipline, of power, and of love. That's the way Christians are supposed to live. So I'll leave you with this as our last verse today, the last verse of the book of Daniel. Go your way till the end, and you shall rest and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of days. God bless you.